Welcome back to History 3011. Tonight, we're taking you back to one of the darkest nights in American history. A single gunshot, a single escape, and a 12-day manhunt that would become the largest in the history of the United States. This is the true story of John Wilkes Booth, the actor who assassinated President Abraham Lincoln and nearly disappeared forever. April 14, 1865. Washington, D.C. Only 5 days had passed since General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. After 4 long years of civil war, America was finally beginning to celebrate peace. The streets were alive with music. Church bells rang across the Capitol. Flags waved proudly from buildings. For the first time in years, people believed the war was finally over. That evening, President Abraham Lincoln decided to enjoy a rare night away from work. He and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attended a comedy performance at Ford's Theater. The audience erupted in applause as the president entered his private balcony. No one inside the theater could have imagined that this joyful evening would soon become one of the most tragic moments in American history. But somewhere behind the stage, another man was quietly preparing for history. His name was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor, handsome, well-known, comfortable inside Ford's Theater. He knew every hallway, every staircase, every hidden entrance. That night, Booth carried a small Derringer pistol and a large hunting knife beneath his coat. He moved calmly through the backstage corridors. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned him. To everyone around him, he simply looked like another actor preparing for the show. As laughter echoed through the theater, Booth slowly climbed the staircase leading toward the president's private box. Only a thin wooden door now separated him from Abraham Lincoln. Inside the balcony, Lincoln leaned forward, completely focused on the performance. The audience laughed loudly at one of the play's funniest lines. It was exactly the moment Booth had been waiting for. He quietly opened the door, raised the pistol, and fired a single shot. The sound disappeared beneath the audience's laughter. For a brief second, almost nobody realized what had happened. Then chaos erupted. Screams filled the theater. People jumped from their seats. Smoke drifted through the presidential box. Without hesitation, Booth leaped from the balcony onto the stage below. Although he injured his leg during the jump, he managed to regain his balance. Within seconds, he disappeared into the darkness outside Ford's Theater. A horse was already waiting. He mounted it and galloped into the night. Across the street, doctors carried the wounded President Lincoln to the nearby Peterson House. Thousands of frightened citizens gathered outside. No one spoke. No one understood what the next few hours would bring. As dawn approached, newspaper presses thundered across Washington. The headlines spread faster than anyone could imagine. President Abraham Lincoln was dead, and somewhere beyond the city, the assassin was still free. But this was only the beginning. Within hours, thousands of soldiers, detectives, and civilians would launch the greatest manhunt America had ever seen. And John Wilkes Booth had only a small head start. The morning of April 15th, 1865, felt unlike any other in American history. The celebration of victory had vanished overnight. Instead of church bells ringing in triumph, they now rang in mourning. Black cloth appeared on buildings across Washington. Businesses closed their doors. Newspapers rushed out special editions, carrying the same heartbreaking headline. The president is dead, but while an entire nation mourned, The government had another urgent mission: find the assassin. Inside the War Department, telegraph machines clicked non-stop. Military officers worked around the clock, sending emergency messages to every major city, railroad station, military post, and river crossing. The order was simple: capture John Wilkes Booth, dead or alive. Soon, thousands of Union soldiers spread across Maryland and Virginia. Bridges were guarded, roads were blocked, ferries were searched, railroad stations were watched day and night. America had never launched a manhunt on this scale before. Meanwhile, Booth was already miles away from Washington. His escape, however, had not gone as planned. When he jumped from the presidential box onto the stage, he had badly injured his left leg. Every mile on horseback brought unbearable pain. Still, he refused to stop. Before sunrise, Booth reached the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a physician living in southern Maryland. Without revealing the full truth, Booth claimed he had fallen from his horse. Dr. Mudd examined the swollen leg. It was broken. Carefully, he set the bone and wrapped it with wooden splints. The treatment allowed Booth to continue his escape, but it also cost him precious hours. Hours that gave Union cavalry time to close the distance. By midday, soldiers were riding across farms, forests, and country roads throughout Maryland. Every traveler was questioned. Every barn was searched. Every suspicious stranger became a possible lead. The government also announced a massive reward for Booth's capture. Posters carrying his name and portrait appeared almost everywhere. For many Americans, the reward was worth more money than they could earn in several years. Suddenly, Booth wasn't just being hunted by soldiers, he was being hunted by an entire nation. As night fell, Booth and his companion, David Harold, hid deep inside a pine forest. A tiny campfire provided little warmth against the cold spring air. Every distant hoofbeat sounded like approaching cavalry. Every snapping branch made them reach for their weapons. They had escaped Washington. But freedom was becoming harder to find. Behind them, Union detectives began discovering fresh horse tracks. Witnesses reported seeing two riders. The search area grew smaller with every passing hour. Then, under the cover of darkness, Booth and Harold crossed the Potomac River into Virginia. They believed they had finally escaped the massive search. But they were wrong. The most dangerous part of the hunt had only just begun. Crossing the Potomac River should have been the beginning of Booth's freedom. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. On the morning of April 18, 1865, Union cavalry crossed into Virginia. The search had entered a new phase. Military officers believed Booth could not stay hidden forever. Every hour he spent on the run made him weaker. His broken leg continued to slow him down. Riding for long periods became almost unbearable, yet stopping was even more dangerous. Across Virginia, detectives questioned farmers, shopkeepers, ferry operators, and travelers. Every rumor was investigated. Every unfamiliar face attracted attention. The circle around Booth was slowly closing. Meanwhile, Booth and David Harold relied on a small network of Confederate sympathizers. Some offered food, others provided temporary shelter. A few shared information about Union patrols, but each stop carried enormous risk. The longer Booth stayed in one place, the greater the chance someone would recognize him. Union intelligence officers worked tirelessly. Large military maps covered their headquarters. Colored pins marked every confirmed sighting. Every witness statement narrowed the search. Road after road disappeared from the map. Escape routes became fewer each day. Booth could feel the pressure. In quiet moments, he opened a small leather diary he carried with him. Inside, he wrote about the assassination. He believed history would remember him as a patriot, but outside that diary, the nation saw something very different. To millions of Americans, he wasn't a hero. He was the man who had murdered their president. As the days passed, Booth became increasingly exhausted. Food was scarce. His injury grew worse. Sleep came only in short, restless moments. Every distant horse sounded like Union cavalry. Every barking dog made him fear discovery. Then, Union detectives received an important new lead. Witnesses reported seeing two suspicious riders traveling deeper into Virginia. The information spread quickly through the military. Cavalry units changed direction. For the first time, investigators believed they were only hours behind their target. Booth had no idea how close the soldiers really were. After days of constant movement, he and David Harold finally reached the farm of Richard Garrett. The peaceful tobacco farm seemed like the perfect hiding place, far away from Washington, far away from crowded towns, far away from the growing manhunt. Garrett welcomed the exhausted travelers, believing they were nothing more than wounded Confederate soldiers looking for shelter. For the first time in many days, Booth allowed himself to believe he might survive. But while darkness covered the quiet Virginia countryside, Union cavalry was already riding toward Garrett Farm. The greatest manhunt in American history was about to reach its final chapter. By the early morning of April 26, 1865, the greatest manhunt in American history was almost over. For 12 long days, John Wilkes Booth had stayed one step ahead of soldiers, detectives, and bounty hunters. But now, his luck was running out. Just before sunrise, Union cavalry quietly arrived at Richard Garrett's farm in Virginia. The soldiers surrounded the property without making a sound. Horses were tied back. Rifles were loaded. No one wanted Booth to escape again. Investigators quickly questioned the Garrett family. Within minutes, they learned that two strangers had spent the night inside a nearby tobacco barn. The officers already knew. Their search was finally over. Inside the barn, Booth and David Harold had no idea they were completely surrounded. The silence outside suddenly broke. A Union officer shouted, "John Wilkes Booth, surrender yourself immediately!" For a few moments, no one answered. Then Booth's voice came from inside the barn, calm, confident, defiant. He refused to surrender. He declared that he would never be taken alive. David Harold, however, made a different choice. Realizing there was no escape, he walked out of the barn with his hands raised. Union soldiers immediately placed him under arrest. Now, Booth stood completely alone, armed with only a rifle and his determination. The officers tried one last time. They promised him a fair trial. They urged him to come out peacefully again. Booth refused. Minutes passed. The standoff continued. Finally, the commanding officer made a difficult decision. If Booth would not come out, they would force him out. Soldiers gathered dry hay around the tobacco barn. A torch was lowered. Within seconds, flames began climbing the wooden walls. Smoke poured through every crack. Inside the burning barn, Booth could now be seen clearly through the growing fire. He stood upright, holding his rifle. His escape was over. The fire grew hotter. Smoke filled the building. Still, he refused to surrender. Then, a single gunshot echoed across the quiet Virginia countryside. Union Sergeant Boston Corbett fired through the side of the burning barn. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. Soldiers rushed inside as the flames spread. They carried the wounded assassin into the cool morning air. Unable to move, Booth looked toward the rising sun. Only hours earlier, he had believed he could still escape. Now, his journey was over. A short time later, John Wilkes Booth died on the Garrett Farm porch. The man who had assassinated Abraham Lincoln had survived only 12 days as America's most wanted fugitive. The greatest manhunt in the nation's history had finally come to an end. But one mystery still remained. Did Booth really act alone? Or was there a larger conspiracy waiting to be uncovered? The manhunt had ended, the trials were over, the conspirators had been punished, but the story of Abraham Lincoln was far greater than the story of the man who killed him. More than a century and a half has passed since that tragic night at Ford's Theater, yet Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most respected leaders in American history. His leadership preserved the Union during the Civil War. His determination helped end slavery in the United States, and his belief that a divided nation could become one again continues to inspire millions around the world. John Wilkes Booth believed that by killing the president, he could change the future of America. In one sense, he did. Lincoln never lived to guide the nation through Reconstruction. The country entered a difficult and uncertain chapter without the leader who had carried it through war. Political conflicts deepened, old divisions remained, and the road toward healing became far longer than anyone had imagined. Yet, Booth failed in the one goal he cared about most. He wanted to destroy Lincoln's legacy. Instead, Lincoln became an enduring symbol of freedom, unity, and hope. Today, his face is carved into Mount Rushmore. His memorial stands in the heart of Washington, D.C. His speeches are still studied in classrooms. His words continue to inspire presidents, leaders, and ordinary people across the world. History remembers John Wilkes Booth, but not for the reason he hoped. His name is remembered as the assassin. Lincoln's name is remembered as the leader. That is one of history's greatest lessons. Violence can change a moment, but it rarely changes the ideals that people believe in. Perhaps that's why this story still matters today. It reminds us that history is not shaped only by wars and battles. Sometimes, it is shaped by a single decision, a single act, or a single individual whose courage leaves a legacy that outlives every tragedy. More than 160 years later, the echoes of that April night can still be felt across America, not because of the gunshot, but because of the principles Abraham Lincoln stood for until his final day. Thank you for watching History 3011. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more true stories from American history, forgotten mysteries, legendary battles, and the events that shape the modern world, please support the channel by subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing this video with fellow history lovers. Every week, we bring you cinematic historical documentaries based on real events. Until our next journey through history, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, history is never just about the past. It's the key to understanding our future. John Wilkes Booth was dead. But for the United States government, the investigation was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The question that haunted Washington was simple. Had Booth acted alone, or had he been part of a much larger conspiracy? Investigators immediately began searching everything Booth had carried during his escape, his weapons, his personal papers, his compass, and most importantly, his diary. Every page was carefully examined for clues, names, meetings, plans, anything that could reveal who else had helped him. Inside the War Department, detectives worked day and night. Maps covered the walls, telegrams arrived every hour. Witness statements were compared. Slowly, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Booth had not acted alone. Several people had helped him before and after the assassination. Some had provided shelter, some had shared information, others had been involved in the original plot itself, one by one. Federal agents began making arrests across Washington. One of the first suspects was Lewis Powell, the man who had attacked Secretary of State William Seward on the very same night Lincoln was shot. When soldiers captured him, his blood-stained clothes and strange behavior immediately raised suspicion. Soon afterward, authorities arrested Mary Surratt, the owner of the boarding house where several conspirators had secretly met before the assassination. For years, historians have debated exactly how much she knew, but at the time, investigators believed she had played an important role in the conspiracy. Meanwhile, David Harold, who had escaped with Booth for nearly 2 weeks, sat alone inside a military prison. His long journey was over. Now, he faced endless questioning from government investigators. As more evidence appeared, the government decided that ordinary civilian courts were not enough. Instead, the accused would face a military tribunal. It was one of the most closely watched trials in American history. Witness after witness stepped forward. Military officers, doctors, theater employees, ordinary citizens. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle. After weeks of hearings, the verdict finally arrived. The commission found the principal conspirators guilty. For 4 of them, the sentence would be death. On July 7, 1865, inside the courtyard of the old Arsenal prison in Washington, the executions were carried out. It marked the final legal chapter of the Lincoln assassination conspiracy. Justice, at least in the eyes of the government, had been served, but no verdict, no execution, and no investigation could erase what had already happened. America had lost its president, and the nation would never be quite the same again. Yet the story wasn't truly over. Lincoln's death would leave a wound far deeper than any courtroom could heal, a wound that would shape America's future for generations to come. With the trials over, America now faced an even greater challenge. How could a nation already scarred by 4 years of civil war move forward after losing the very man who had guided it through its darkest days? On the morning after Abraham Lincoln's death, thousands gathered outside the Peterson house. No speeches were given, no music was played. People simply stood in silence. Many removed their hats. Others wiped away tears. The grief was visible on every face, inside the White House. Lincoln's chair now sat empty. For the first time in 4 years, the nation had to imagine a future without the man who had preserved the Union. Vice President Andrew Johnson quickly took the oath of office. The country needed leadership, but no one could replace Abraham Lincoln. Soon afterward, one of the most extraordinary funeral processions in American history began. Lincoln's body was placed aboard a special funeral train. Instead of taking the shortest route home, the train followed nearly the same path Lincoln had traveled when he came to Washington as president 4 years earlier. It crossed hundreds of miles, passed through 7 states, stopped in major cities, and allowed millions of Americans to say goodbye. Wherever the train arrived, crowds were already waiting. Some stood for hours, others traveled for days. Church bells rang, black banners hung from buildings. Entire towns fell silent as the train slowly passed. Historians estimate that millions of people witnessed some part of Lincoln's funeral journey. For many, it was the only chance they would ever have to honor the man they called the savior of the Union. Finally, the journey ended in Springfield, Illinois, the city where Lincoln had built his career, the city he had once called home. There, he was laid to rest. But Lincoln's death created questions that no funeral could answer. What would happen to the South? How would the country rebuild after the Civil War? Could the nation remain united without the leader who had held it together? Inside the Capitol, lawmakers debated the future of Reconstruction. Every decision they made would shape America for decades to come. Across the country, families slowly returned to their daily lives. But something had changed forever. The Civil War had ended. Yet a deep national wound remained. Lincoln was gone, but his vision of a united America would continue to inspire generations that followed, and more than 150 years later, his name is still remembered as one of the greatest presidents in American history. But perhaps the greatest legacy of all was not how Abraham Lincoln died. It was the nation he helped save.